Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're plunging into a single pretty compelling source, the book The Authoritarian Moment by Ben Shapiro.
Right.
And our goal here is really just to explore the arguments, the examples this book presents, focusing on its central idea.
Which is?
Well, the thesis is that the most significant authoritarian threat facing America today comes, in the author's view, from the political left, and specifically its influence on major institutions.
Yeah, that's right. And it's really important for you listening to remember, our mission here is simply to walk you through this specific source material.
Exactly.
We're presenting its viewpoint, the evidence it cites, without us endorsing it or refuting it.
Right. Not taking sides.
Think of this as just an impartial guide, basically.
Yeah.
Helping you understand one particular perspective on, well, a very complex topic.
Okay, so let's start at the top. The book's core argument.
Mm-hmm.
The source acknowledges that, yes, you can see authoritarian tendencies on the right. And events like, January 6th highlighted that.
Sure.
But its main point, its contention, is that the more dangerous, the more pervasive threat today actually comes from the left.
And crucially, the source isn't talking about traditional government tyranny here. Not kings or dictators in the old sense.
Okay.
It defines this threat as cultural authoritarianism. So something enforced less by state power and more through pressure, societal pressure, institutional pressure.
Right. And the book specifically calls out some mainstream media figures, writers, people like Paul Krugman, Lisa McGurr, arguing they focus almost entirely on right-wing authoritarianism, often linking it directly to conservatism. And the source says this focus misses a huge part of the picture.
And the author suggests that this tendency, authoritarianism itself, is maybe deeply rooted in human nature. It even brings up a biblical story.
Oh, yeah? Which one?
The book of Samuel, where the people of Israel ask for a king, even though they were warned about the downsides. The source sees this as like an early example of people looking for safety, for satisfaction in earthly authority, even when they know it might not end well.
So it's not just about safety, but also maybe, as the source puts it, this desire to use power for the remolding of man to reshape society.
Exactly. That idea of transformation through power. And the source contrasts that traditional government authority with threats to modern democracy, focusing particularly on, it calls it ochlocracy.
Ochlocracy.
Yeah, rule by the mob. The book argues this mob rule can lead to authoritarianism through two kinds of brutality.
Okay.
There's reactionary brutality, which it links to the right sort of seeking protection from change, and then utopian brutality, which it links to the left, driven by this desire to radically transform humanity. And uses Weimar Germany as an example, arguing these two forces kind of fed off each other, paving the way for tyranny.
Okay, interesting. Shifting gears slightly, the source gets into the psychology angle, right? This idea of an authoritarian personality.
It discusses the Frankfurt School's work, like Adorno's research.
Right.
Which initially focused on what they called a pre-fascist personality, mostly tied to the right. The source suggests those early studies maybe overlooked left-wing authoritarianism because of the researchers' own biases.
And then it mentions Robert Altemeyer's work, the right-wing authoritarianism scale, the RWA scale.
Yeah, exactly. That measured traits like, submission to authority, aggression towards outgroups, conventionalism.
And Altemeyer found what?
Well, surprisingly, his initial findings suggested liberals weren't really prone to this kind of thinking.
But the source pushes back on that.
It does. It brings in counter-research by Lucian Conway. Apparently, Conway adapted Altemeyer's scale but used left-wing premises instead.
Okay.
And the book highlights Conway's findings that using this adapted left-wing authoritarianism, or LWA scale, liberals actually scored highest.
Really?
Yeah. The source argues this research, including work by someone named Thomas Costello, shows that people on the left can be just as dogmatic, prejudiced, maybe even extremist, just with a different set of beliefs, a different dogma.
So the point is, authoritarian tendencies aren't just on one side.
That's the source's argument. It even notes that Adorno himself, later on, recognized a kind of thoughtless violence among student radicals in the 1960s.
Which contrasts with Herbert Marcuse.
Right, who famously defended repressive tolerance, basically, censoring right-wing views and even described some left-wing violence back then as fresh air.
Wow. Okay, so the source's perspective is, authoritarians exist across the board, but its focus right now is on the specific way it sees it manifesting most powerfully on the left today.
Exactly. And this leads right into the source's really central claim that a core of radicals has essentially taken over or gained significant influence within America's most powerful institutions. And the book argues this is causing this sort of miasmatic hatred, as it calls it, and real consequences for Americans who hold views that maybe weren't controversial before, but now fall outside this new institutional norm.
And the source lays out a kind of strategy, a three-step process it claims the left used.
Yeah. Step 1, winning the emotional argument. Step 2, renormalizing the institutions. And step 3, locking all the doors.
Renormalizing. What does that mean exactly, according to the source?
It's the process of making something that was previously considered outside the norm, maybe extreme, seem acceptable, even normal, and eventually making the old normal seem extreme or unacceptable.
Got it. And the book really pushes back against the idea that major institutions supported right-wing actions, particularly around January 6th.
Yeah, it argues the opposite. The institutions like the press, parts of the government, actually acted as a check on perceived right-wing authoritarian moves.
How so?
Well, it cites examples like pushback against certain Trump administration actions, sometimes from within his own government, or the constant media scrutiny he faced.
And the source argues the institutional reaction against conservatives after January 6th further proves this point.
That's the claim. It brings up examples like GoDaddy taking the AR15.com website offline,
Okay.
and the coordinated deplatforming of Parler, the social media app, by Apple, Google Play, Amazon Web Services, all pretty much at once.
And it contrasts that with Facebook and Twitter.
Right, saying, coordination happened on those platforms too, but they didn't lose their fundamental infrastructure in the same way Parler did.
The book also mentions specific government figures, right? Advocating for certain actions after January 6th.
Yes, people like AOC suggesting a media literacy commission, or Senator Ron Wyden pushing for big legislative changes like D.C. statehood and voting rights expansion, framing it as a necessary response. James Clyburn urging Biden to use executive authority unilaterally.
So the source connects this whole institutional shift to the broader culture war.
Exactly. It argues that the main division in America today is cultural, not just economic or racial. And this cultural divide is what the institutional capture, as it sees it, is really intensifying.
And it pushes back against purely economic or racial explanations?
Yeah, it challenges theories focusing only on class, like Piketty's or race, maybe like Nicole Hannah-Jones's work. It might cite things like polling data suggesting Trump's support actually increased among some minority groups in 2020 as counter-evidence to purely racial explanations.
This leads to the idea of the silent majority.
The book argues there's this large group of people who feel targeted, maybe attacked, by cultural institutions. And because of that, they just choose not to speak their minds publicly, sometimes not even to pollsters.
And the source suggests this might explain some polling misses in recent elections.
That's offered as one possible explanation, that there's this hidden sentiment.
So the core point here is that institutions, according to the source, are being weaponized by what it calls the authoritarian left.
Right, to enforce a kind of ideological conformity and to punish dissent. The source argues this creates a very real feeling of institutional hatred towards conservatives, or just anyone not aligned with this specific ideology.
And this happens across the board. Schools, work, media.
That's the argument. Academia, media, sports, entertainment, even workplaces, social circles. It's pervasive, according to the book.
And this pressure to conform, it shows up in everyday life.
Apparently so. The source talks about feeling judged for things like going to church, voting Republican, maybe not posting a specific social media square, or not kneeling for the anthem, or using certain pronouns or the right hashtags, even who you associate with. Guilt by association.
There's an anecdote in the book, isn't there, about someone tweeting something positive about Ben Shapiro.
Yeah, and facing this huge backlash, ended up deleting the tweet and issuing this apology that the source describes as like something out of a Maoist struggle session.
Which leads to this major consequence that the source calls cancel culture.
Right. Described as really devastating. Potentially leading to losing your job, being ostracized socially. This constant fear that something you said or did in the past could be dug up and used against you.
So it forces people into silence. Or
into what source calls performative compliance.
Yeah.
Basically just saying or doing what's expected to avoid trouble, like standing and applauding for Stalin, as the source puts it, just to get by.
Now, the source does acknowledge this isn't a First Amendment issue, right? Losing your job isn't government censorship.
Correct. It makes that distinction. But it argues that this cultural pressure, this widespread pressure, effectively functions as a form of cultural authoritarianism.
How so?
By killing free speech and the open exchange of ideas in practice. Not through law, but by destroying what it calls philosophical tolerance. It even echoes Alexis de Tocqueville's warnings about democratic societies potentially creating a tyranny of opinion that targets the soul, the conscience.
And it quotes Jim Vandehei.
Yeah, suggesting that Blue America is basically ascendant now across institutions, government, media, tech platforms, corporate power, and is actively rethinking core ideas about politics, free speech, even truth itself.
Okay, so let's get specific. How does the source argue this institutional capture actually happened? Starting with universities.
Right. The source argues universities were sort of ground zero, one of the first targets,
Right.
and that they've been renormalized into what the book calls factories for wokeism.
Wow, okay. How does it trace that change?
It describes a shift away from, a traditional liberal academic consensus that valued free inquiry above all.
And what caused that shift, according to the source?
The book argues it collapsed partly because of postmodernism, which, as the source sees it, kind of dismissed objective reason and logic.
Mm-hmm.
And the source claims this critique was applied selectively, mostly to Western civilization, while maybe exempting other cultures, and this ultimately empowered identity groups based on perceived victimhood status.
It also looks back at the 60s student protests.
Yeah, it re-examines things like the Berkeley free speech movement, suggesting maybe it wasn't just about free speech, but also about power. It cites examples like student takeovers of buildings at Harvard, Columbia, Cornell.
And argues the administrators caved.
Basically, yeah. That they capitulated, losing what the source, citing Shelby Steele, calls their moral authority.
And does the source provide data on political leanings now?
It does. It points to surveys, like one from the Harvard Crimson showing faculty are overwhelmingly liberal, very few conservatives. A Yale survey showed similar results. The book's argument is that conservatives have just been systematically weeded out over the years.
So much so that even traditional liberals feel marginalized now?
That's the claim. It mentions former ACLU head Ira Glasser, observing that many law students today apparently see free speech as fundamentally incompatible with pursuing social justice.
And there are examples of liberal professors being targeted.
Yeah, the book gives examples like Brett Weinstein at Evergreen State or Nicholas and Erica Christakis at Yale, that whole controversy over Halloween costumes.
The source also talks about credentialism.
Right, and the social cachet of higher education. It brings up the college admissions scandal, Lori Loughlin, Felicity Huffman, as an example of how valuable that credential is perceived to be, maybe apart from the actual education.
And Olivia Jade's perspective is mentioned.
Yeah, kind of highlighting that attitude. The book also notes degree inflation. Lots of grads ending up in jobs that don't really require a degree. While, interestingly, some top high school grads who don't go to college can actually outperform college grads from the bottom quartile in terms of career success.
So this leads the source to argue college is creating a kind of new ruling class.
That's the term it uses, distinct from a new lower class, characterized by different lifestyles, mostly liberal beliefs, and speaking this specific language the source calls the holy tongue of wokeness.
Okay, define wokeism as the source sees it.
The source defines it as a framework rooted in identity politics and intersectionality. It basically sees societal structures primarily through the lens of oppression.
And it rejects objective systems.
It argues that this framework often rejects things like objective reason or science if they seem to produce unequal outcomes between different identity groups.
And it cites specific woke thinkers.
Yeah, people like Ibram X. Kendi, mentioning his idea that racial inequality is evidence of racist policy, or Robin DiAngelo's claim that disparity in condition can only be the result of systemic discrimination.
And Kendi's more controversial statement.
Right, the assertion that the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. That's highlighted by the source.
So this vocabulary, the source sees it as a kind of code.
Pretty much, a signaling mechanism for belonging to this new ruling class. It's described as almost a religious, unfalsifiable worldview that demands fluency and strict adherence.
And it's not about persuasion.
The source argues no, it's more about group solidarity, identifying who's in and who's out, purging the unbelievers almost. The author links this idea to Christopher Lasch.
And examples of this vocabulary include
Things like specific pronoun usage, terms like Latinx, systemic or institutional discrimination, adding modifiers like environmental justice, microaggressions, trigger warnings, talking about my truth, calling out structures of power, patriarchy, heteronormativity, cisnormativity, all that kind of language.
The source also brings up the so-called squared hoax.
Yeah, where academics got absurd papers published in journals just by using the right woke jargon. The source uses this as evidence that, in its view, parts of academia now reward scholarship focused on social grievances more than on actual truth-finding.
So the overall goal of universities outside of maybe STEM isn't job training anymore, according to the source?
That's the argument. It's more about credentialing people and initiating them into this new ruling class and its specific language, its vocabulary. The source points to big budgets for social justice-oriented courses and this large growing diversity bureaucracy on campuses as evidence.
Okay, let's move to the next institution. Science. The source argues that even science, which is supposed to be about objective truth, has surrendered to this authoritarian leftism.
That's the claim, yeah, despite its method in pursuit of objectivity.
It makes a distinction between actual science and what?
The science TM. That's the term the source uses for what it sees as politicized messaging, distinct from the actual scientific process.
And it discusses this ultra-crepidarian problem.
Right, which is basically scientists speaking with authority on things outside their specific expertise.
Examples.
The source gives examples related to COVID policies, like some health officials apparently downplaying protest risks while discouraging other activities, or doctors declaring racism a bigger threat than COVID itself. Ashish Shah's statements are mentioned too.
And climate change.
Similar idea. The source notes the huge uncertainties in climate models, the massive economic costs of policies like the Green New Deal,
Right.
and argues that scientists often push specific political solutions while dismissing alternatives like adaptation, geoengineering, nuclear, even fracking, and labeling dissenters as deniers.
The source also talks about a bleed-over effect.
Yeah, the idea that social justice ideology is sort of bleeding over into scientific fields, potentially narrowing research to only acceptable topics, pushing out dissenters,
And prioritizing ideology over truth.
prioritizing what the source calls a kind of leftist theology that demands equal outcomes for all groups, even if the data doesn't support it. That's the argument.
What examples does it give of this?
Well, controversies around discussing things like IQ and group differences Sam Harris has mentioned, or aptitudes of men and women, Lawrence Summers comments at Harvard,
Okay.
and journals retracting studies not because the research was flawed, but because of perceived potential harm. Nature changing its policy is cited.
Gender dysphoria research is a big focus for the source here, isn't it?
It is. The source highlights the sharp increase in reported rates, especially among young girls.
And it mentions specific studies or books being suppressed?
Yeah, it discusses Lisa Lippman's study on rapid onset gender dysphoria being pulled by Brown University after pressure, and Abigail Schreier's book on the topic allegedly being suppressed. The ACLU advocating censorship is also mentioned.
And it critiques the rejection of watchful waiting.
Right. And the push, as the source sees it, to redefine sex based on subjective identity, your truth, over objective biological reality. It mentions an NEJM article on sex designations and alleges doctors or journalists who don't encourage transition are blacklisted.
This woke influence is seen within scientific organizations, too.
According to the source, yes. It gives examples like the American Physical Society holding a strike for Black lives, the journal Nature having anti-racist lab rules, a Princeton faculty letter proposing prizes for anti-racist research. It also mentions computer science professors complaining about cancel culture and the NURI PS conference requiring political impact statements with paper submissions.
Then there's the push for diversification in science.
Yeah, the source frames this as prioritizing demographic representation over meritocracy.
Oh.
It highlights the Association of American Medical Colleges hosting speakers like Ibram X. Kendi and Nicole Hannah-Jones, who, according to the source, argued standardized tests like the MCAT are racist.
And called for changes.
Advocated for lowering standards or prioritizing hiring based on race to achieve demographic targets. Kendi's Stage 4 metastatic racism comment and Hannah-Jones wanting more Black doctors are cited.
And the source's reaction to this?
It calls it insulting and dangerous, arguing it leads to admitting less than qualified people into critical fields like medicine.
Does it provide data?
It includes medical school admissions data suggesting significant gaps in average MCAT scores between accepted Black applicants and rejected white or Asian applicants with higher scores.
There's also the example of the chemist Tomasz Szydlicki.
Right. According to the source, he was attacked and silenced for arguing that prioritizing diversity over merit damages standards and discriminates against qualified candidates.
And this caused controversy.
Apparently, Nobel laureates resigned from a journal board over how it was handled. The source argues there's no solid evidence that diversity trumps ability when it comes to improving scientific outcomes.
Okay, let's shift to corporations. The source argues that even big business, traditionally seen as maybe conservative or at least market-focused, has become a tool for this authoritarian leftism.
That's the argument, even though corporations are primarily about profit, not ideology.
It acknowledges they lobby government, right? Regulatory capture.
Oh, yeah. Historically, corporations seek closeness with government power. That's nothing new.
So what changed, according to the source? Why embrace wokeism?
The source points to a few converging factors. One, legal structures that create liability if companies don't follow certain political correctness rules.
Okay.
Two, motivated and politically active customer bases who demand it. Three, pressure from within what the source calls authoritarian staffers demanding conformity. And four, just sheer fear of media backlash. A bad headline.
It gives examples from after the George Floyd protests.
Lots of them. Big names like Walmart, Apple, Microsoft, Netflix, Ben & Jerry's, even Gushers Candy. Making statements, funding initiatives. The source notes this often happened while they ignored or downplayed things like looting during some protests. And it argues that by labeling the American system itself as systemically racist, these companies are kind of undermining the very system that allowed their success.
And the internal pressure from employees is significant.
The source suggests it is. That corporations are often catering to, or maybe afraid of, their own woke staffers who demand compliance, even things like days off for mental health during politically difficult times.
And the media fear.
Huge factor, according to the book. Corporations feel held hostage, it says, by media outlets that frame business as good only when it aligns with progressive goals. The threat of a bad headline, a boycott campaign, that can apparently generate real fear, even potential government action.
This connects to stakeholder capitalism.
Right, versus traditional shareholder capitalism. The source links this idea, promoted by Klaus Schwab, the World Economic Forum, supported by figures like Joe Biden, to business leaders trying to look good and appease the left.
Wow.
By prioritizing things like gender pay gap reports, staff diversity numbers, emission reductions, taxes paid, over just pure profitability. The source argues this essentially lets the left impose regulations on them and notes the U.S. Business Roundtable basically signed on to this idea.
And there are specific examples of companies enforcing these priorities.
Yeah, NASDAQ proposing board diversity quotas needing women, racial minorities, LGBTQ members, Goldman Sachs requiring diverse board members for companies they take public, the NYSE having an advisory council for diversity.
The source also talks about destroying dissenters in the corporate world.
It mentions the CEO of Expensify emailing all their customers, urging them to vote for Biden as one kind of example.
And diversity training programs.
The source is pretty critical. Citing a Harvard Business Review study, it says these trainings are often ineffective at actually changing behavior, but very effective at creating conformity, sometimes triggering anger.
And they cost a lot.
Billions spent, apparently.
Yeah.
And a huge increase in diversity professionals. The source basically calls some of these trainings indoctrination, requiring struggle sessions and forcing employees to accept what it calls false notions of racial essentialism.
Corporate responses to boycotts like Goya or Equinox are seen as evidence of fear.
Yeah, the source argues companies often just apologize and beg for mercy, which only encourages more pressure. It perpetuates the cycle.
And Yelp's system for flagging businesses accused of racism.
The source calls that woke snitching, arguing it allows businesses to be potentially destroyed based on just tips, maybe unsubstantiated claims.
This leads to the idea of two separate systems of commerce.
Right, based on politics. The source gives examples of companies allegedly acting against conservatives, credit card companies, or banks targeting groups like the NRA or specific activists. Companies boycotting states over laws they dislike, like bathroom bills or abortion laws.
And the law doesn't protect political views in the same way.
Often not, the source points out. Anti-discrimination laws usually don't cover political viewpoints, leaving conservatives potentially vulnerable. It suggests a trend towards huge companies with rigid cultures that mirror the prevailing political winds, preferred by managers who like order. These companies then become tools of this obedience-demanding ideology.
Okay, let's pivot to entertainment. Hollywood. The source argues it's gone beyond just being liberal and has been radicalized.
That's the term used, yeah. A tool of authoritarian leftism in its view.
What's the evidence presented?
Well, it points to things like the Academy Awards changing the standards for Best Picture, adding these inclusion standards based on diversity in casting, staffing, marketing.
Rather than just quality.
The source argues it shifts the focus from purely artistic merit to meeting ideological criteria, framed by the Academy, of course, as essential positive change.
And the hashtag #MeToo movement in Hollywood.
The source suggests that while it started by addressing real issues like sexual harassment and Weinstein, the casting couch history, it kind of morphed
Into what?
into a platform for lecturing the rest of America about broader issues like inherent sexism, criticizing heteronormativity, pushing general left-wing talking points, turning Hollywood, as the source puts it, from moral pariah to moral leader.
The book argues Hollywood has a long history of promoting leftism.
Yeah, portraying conservatives often as villains, foils, or just incompetent. It cites a Shonda Rhimes quote about not writing for Trump supporters and general trends in TV portrayals, with maybe libertarians being the exception sometimes.
And why does the source think this matters so much?
It quotes Andrew Breitbart. Culture is upstream of politics. The idea is that what people watch shapes how they feel politically.
Because we consume so much entertainment.
Exactly. Hours per day on TV, streaming services. The source points to studies, like from the Norman Lear Center, suggesting this consumption shifts audiences towards more liberal views over time.
Cancel culture is discussed in the Hollywood context, too.
Definitely. And not just hitting conservatives, but anyone perceived as insufficiently woke or maybe just outdated. The source claims many classic movies or shows simply wouldn't get made today.
And studios are pre-screening content.
Apparently, with activist groups like GLA, to ensure what they consider fair and accurate representation of, say, LGBT people.
Examples of content being changed or removed.
Yeah, specific scenes or episodes from The Office, Community, Gone with the Wind getting a disclaimer on HBO Max, Disney Plus adding warnings to older films, shows like Cops and Live PD being canceled.
And individual artists being targeted.
Right. Scarlett Johansson dropping out of playing a transgender character after backlash, arguing only a trans person could play the part. Sarah Silverman talking about cancel culture and how there's no room for redemption.
The source uses that term renormalization here, too.
Yeah. Arguing Hollywood now caters to an intransigent minority, inflexible critics, certain vocal audience segments rather than the broadest possible audience.
And critics are out of touch.
It cites examples where critics loved a movie but audiences hated it, or vice versa, like Ghostbusters 2016 or Star Wars, The Last Jedi. The source claims that when audiences dissent, critics often label them toxic fans or bigots, rather than considering if the criticism of the content itself might be valid.
This extends to sports as well.
The source argues yes, that sports media, like ESPN, caters increasingly to its more left-leaning audience and the political media,
Favoring certain leagues.
suggesting bias towards covering the NFL and NBA more favorably than, say, NASCAR, despite different fan-base demographics and spending habits.
Examples of wokeness in sports.
The Rams players' hands up, don't shoot gesture. The NFL reportedly denying the Cowboys permission for a helmet decal honoring fallen police officers, and the huge media, Nike, and NFL support for Colin Kaepernick, despite performance questions or controversies, according to the source.
And this has an impact.
The source points to declining audience numbers and ratings in some leagues, like the NFL, and for networks like ESPN, suggesting this politicization might be a contributing factor.
Okay, now the media itself, establishment media. The source seems to see this as maybe the primary institution pushing authoritarian leftism.
Yeah, it's pretty central to the book's argument, describing the media as engaging in cram-downs of this ideology, cheering on aggression, participating in censorship, promoting only one moral side.
It focuses heavily on the coverage of the George Floyd protests and riots.
Very much so. The source argues the media pushed a specific narrative of systemic racism based on what it calls questionable or even false premises.
Like what?
Details around the Floyd incident itself, statistics on police shootings. It specifically calls the widespread hands up, don't shoot narrative derived from Ferguson an overt lie.
And the portrayal of the unrest.
The source claims the media downplayed or justified violence and looting, using phrases like mostly a protest or CNN's infamous fiery but mostly peaceful graphic.
And cheering calls to defund the police.
Yes, and the source directly links that media push to subsequent increases in homicides in major cities.
The source sees this as a deliberate abandonment of objectivity.
Absolutely. It quotes Don Lemon arguing his identity isn't biased, it's his lens, and claiming his opinions are facts and that objectivity doesn't mean reporting other sides.
The book gives some historical context on objectivity.
It does. It notes that newspapers used to be openly partisan, then shifted towards objectivity after World War I. Walter Lippmann's idea of journalists as a priestly caste guarding against misinformation.
But the source says that's over now.
Argues the facade is completely dropped, and that modern pseudo-journalism, journalism TM, the source calls it, just presents opinions as facts while claiming moral superiority.
So real objectivity, according to the source,
Is basically allegiance to refracting facts through the prism of leftism. That's the quote. It cites coverage of Obama versus Trump versus Biden as evidence of this inherent bias and a lack of false balance.
And journalists acting as activists.
Provides examples, like Wesley Lowery's Twitter activity, and his stated view that reporting the broader narrative of race was more important than specific factual details in cases like Ferguson.
This leads to the idea of woke internal renormalization within newsrooms.
Yeah, describing these battles inside places like the New York Times between basically authoritarian leftists and older-style liberals.
Where the left wins.
The source argues the left intimidates the liberals into canceling conservatives or dissenting voices to establish their ideological monopoly.
The James Bennett case at the NYT is a key example.
Right. The op-ed editor fired for publishing Senator Tom Cotton's column about using the military to quell riots, and while key staffers claimed the column endangered them.
And the paper changed its approach.
Adopted a more aggressive approach, admitting they'd be less likely to publish opinions perceived as harmful, according to the source.
And this is contrasted with the NYT's defense of Nicole Hannah-Jones and the 1619 Project.
Exactly. The source slams the 1619 Project as egregiously flawed, containing outright lying, trying to recast all of American history around slavery as the central founding principle, blaming systemic racism for everything from traffic patterns to using Excel spreadsheets.
Despite criticism.
Yeah, from numerous historians, even internal fact-checkers apparently raised concerns. Yet the source notes it won a Pulitzer and got adapted for film and TV.
The media is also accused of pressuring social media to censor.
Yes, the source argues the media pushed platforms to censor conservative ideas to try and regain their information monopoly, using the fake news label to justify it, blurring lines between actual foreign disinformation and domestic misinformation they just disagree with.
Citing specific media figure.
People like Joe Scarborough, Kara Swisher, Kevin Roose, apparently pushing Facebook, Twitter, YouTube to restrict content, change algorithms to hide borderline content, or boost authoritative sources. Which, the source argues, inevitably means favoring established, mainstream, often left-leaning outlets, essentially framing free speech as the problem and corporate censorship as the solution.
The source also critiques fact-checkers.
Yeah, places like the AP, PolitiFact, FactCheck.org, Snopes, arguing they often label true statements mostly false, based on subjective interpretations of lack of context or just their own opinion.
Examples.
Cites PolitiFact's rating of Obama's "If You Like Your Plan" healthcare promise, or Snopes' handling of a claim AOC made about the Capitol riot.
It also mentions internal Facebook document.
Yeah, reported by the Washington Post, allegedly showing Facebook policed anti-black hate speech much more aggressively than anti-white hate speech.
And the media's tone after Biden's inauguration.
The source points to commentary like, "The adults are back in the room," celebrating the new press secretary, warning against being too harsh on Biden. Seeing it as evidence the media went back to being lapdogs after being watchdogs during the Trump years.
So the conclusion on the media is pretty harsh.
Very. The source basically says they're not guardians of democracy, but political activists using their platforms to crush dissent and destroy opponents, seeking an idea monopoly.
Okay, final institution. Social media, initially seen as liberating, right?
Yeah, the promise of free information, the new town square. But the source argues it's become an oligopoly, powerful companies willing to restrict access and information.
And the Hunter Biden laptop story is the prime example.
It's presented as Exhibit A of this censorship. The New York Post report on emails suggesting Joe Biden knew about or was involved in Hunter's Ukraine dealings, potentially contradicting his claims.
And the source emphasizes the reporting on where the laptop came from.
Right. Dropped off at a repair shop, seized by the FBI. Details were reported.
But the reaction was?
Immediate dismissal by the Biden campaign and many media allies as Russian disinformation. A claim the source says was false, and later undermined by reports that Hunter had been under federal investigation since 2018 anyway.
And the platforms took action.
Big time. Twitter blocked the Post story entirely, locked accounts including the Post's. Facebook publicly said it was manually limiting the story's distribution while waiting for fact-checkers.
Which never came before the election.
Right. The source emphasizes that point. The check never materialized in time.
So the source argues this showed a shift From fighting foreign disinformation to censoring domestic misinformation.
Exactly. Defining misinformation very broadly as basically narratives the left dislikes. It even cites Vanita Gupta apparently bragging about pressuring Facebook to change its standards on this.
And the mechanisms of control are algorithms?
Partly. Algorithms designed initially for removing obvious bad stuff like spam or illegal content. But increasingly, the source argues they're used to foster positive conversation or quiet misinformation.
Oh.
By demoting what they call borderline content, or stories from sources deemed to have low news ecosystem quality scores, which again, the source argues favors mainstream left-leaning outlets.
And the media pressure is key here again.
The source reiterates that. Media pushes, platforms comply.
The book also talks about social media enabling crowdsourcing the revolution.
Yeah, describing it as a roving mob, and sometimes the media uses it as a kind of tip line and action arm.
Citing examples of individuals mobbed online.
Yes, the case of Mimi Groves, a high school senior whose old Snapchat video using a racial slur was dug up and spread by another student during the BLM protests.
And the consequences.
She was removed from her college cheer team, ultimately withdrew from the university. The source criticizes the New York Times for framing this as accountability, not as a destructive mobbing.
It discusses the mechanics of these mobs.
How virality works, especially on Twitter, trending topics based on velocity, not necessarily scope, how it rewards speaking out and piling on, how quickly mobs form. The Justine Sacco example, the infamous tweet before a flight, is also mentioned.
And why does media cover these?
The source suggests it's partly for traffic and easy stories, and they can act as both crusader and reporter, shaping the narrative, sometimes presenting isolated incidents as proof of broad trends referencing the Covington Catholic High School kids and Nick Sandmann's portrayal.
Deplatforming comes up again. Parler.
Yes, Parler being banned by Apple, Amazon, Google after January 6th. The source argues this was based on flimsy claims about coordination there, while much larger platforms like Facebook and Twitter played a bigger role but faced fewer consequences. It also notes the subsequent targeting of encrypted services like Telegram and Signal as part of crushing dissent.
But despite all this manipulation, the source thinks people see it.
It concludes that section by citing Pew Research data showing that most Americans are aware of social media bias and are worried about censorship.
Okay, let's move to the end of the book. The choice before us, how to fight back.
Right. The author basically says, look, this authoritarian moment is real, but the authoritarian left is ultimately a minority. They rely on compulsion, on making people feel insecure.
And the core message for resistance is?
Pretty simple. They can't cancel us if we don't let them.
Okay, so how? What's the strategy proposed? 3 pillars.
Yeah. First, refuse to be silenced. Reject the left's framework, as the source sees it. That means rejecting the idea that subjective offense trumps free expression, the cordiality principle it calls it, rejecting the idea that speech equals violence, and rejecting that silence equals violence or complicity.
So disagree respectfully.
Right. Argue your points, even unpopular ones like maybe opposing same-sex marriage, but do it decently. The source distinguishes between being politically incorrect, saying necessary things politely, and just being a jerk, a generic run-of-the-mill jackass. Bravery and honest, decent speech, it argues, attract followers.
Okay, pillar 2.
Renormalize institutions. Basically, fight back from within. Create your own intransigent minority.
People willing to stand up.
Exactly. People willing to stand firm, speak out, refuse to just go along with the ideological demands, the power hierarchy.
It uses the Donald McNeil Jr. case at the NYT again.
Yeah, the guy fired for saying the N-word while discussing the word's use. The source calls that standard insane authoritarianism, but notes that the editors actually walked back the decision somewhat later, under pressure.
So the question is, what if people collectively refused?
Right. What if employees refused to participate in cancellations, refused the mandatory diversity training, refused the struggle sessions? What if religious Americans just refused to be silenced? The argument is that this kind of authoritarianism often backs down when it meets real, solid resistance from a significant group.
And the third pillar?
Pry open institutions. This is for places the source sees as totally captured by dedicated authoritarians, where just arguing won't work.
So what then?
Use the legal system against them. Use existing laws, even if maybe they were originally used against conservatives.
Like civil rights laws?
Yeah, the example given is using the Civil Rights Act to challenge mandatory diversity trainings that segregate people or teach inherent white privilege.
An ugly option.
The source acknowledges that, especially for people who believe strongly in freedom of association. but suggests it might be necessary when the legal system is already being weaponized against people just for having the wrong politics.
The author wraps up with a personal note about the future.
Yeah, expressing worry, especially for kids. Growing up in a climate where differing views are less tolerated, exploring ideas feels risky, where you could lose your livelihood for speaking out of turn.
The core fear being.
That kids might feel forced to reject their parents' values just to fit in, just to participate in society, or face being basically excommunicated if they speak what they believe is true.
But the source ends on a slightly hopeful note, connecting back to the silent majority.
Kind of. It reiterates that millions, maybe tens of millions of Americans feel this way, and that this feeling of being silenced is the problem, but it's also the potential solution.
Because the authoritarian moment relies on their acquiescence.
Exactly. It relies on the passive acceptance of this majority, if they stop acquiescing.
And it mentions the Gina Carano partnership.
Yeah, as evidence that people recognize this need for solidarity, for a consolidated counterattack, as the source puts it. That people are ready to support those who push back.
Okay, so that wraps up our deep dive into the authoritarian moment. We've really walked through the source's main argument, this idea of a cultural authoritarian threat from the left working through institutions.
Yeah, we've looked at its perspective on the roots of authoritarianism, its view of the authoritarian mindset on the left, and all those detailed examples across universities, science, corporations, entertainment, media, social media. Quite a sweep.
The source's central point really seems to be about this deep cultural division in America, making many people feel silenced, pressured by these powerful institutional forces.
And we covered the book's proposed strategy for fighting back, refusing silence, pushing back inside institutions, and using the legal system.
So, maybe a final thought for you listening. Consider the source's argument that this authoritarian moment hinges on the silent majority just going along with it, and that provocative idea. They can't cancel us if we don't let them. What might not letting them actually look like for you? And what ultimately is the cost of silence, according to this source? Something to think about.